To that end, we're going to talk about what is labor. We're going to talk about relations and why study it, some of which we covered in the introduction to the course. We're going to talk about labor unions today and some of the pros and cons. We'll talk about why join a union, and then we'll talk about what's it mean to have a union membership once it's been joined. And a lot of this we're going to try to look at from different perspectives, right? We want to look at it from the employee's perspective or the participant's perspective, and we want to look at it from the employer or the organization's perspective, because there are a lot of implications from both of these perspectives that are very different from one another. The chapter is outlined by giving us some discussion on the opportunities for growth. So with the demise of General Motors, or a lot of the union activity with respect to General Motors, the auto union, the United Auto Workers, was a very large, had a very large role in union development. And because of the increased globalization, again, we touched on that during our introduction, it's minimized the effect of that, as well as just the economic factors or problems that have plagued the auto industry. We want to talk about labor management cooperation. The chapter discusses some about General Motors and a trial sort of experiment between General Motors and some unions. We want to talk about the types of unions. We want to talk about unions in professional sports. They're all, whether it's baseball or basketball or football, there are unions in all of these sports leagues that, and if you follow sports very much, they really can impact a season. And then we want to talk about the National Labor Relations Board. So when we talk about labor relations and why study it, first we have to kind of define what labor relations means. So it's really any activity between management and unions or employees concerning the negotiation or implementation of a collective bargaining agreement. And so then we want to talk about, well, what then does collective bargaining agreement entail? And that is a written and signed document between an employer entity or the organization and a labor organization specifying the terms and conditions of employment for a specified period of time. And so really what labor relations is about is dealing with the issues, and we touched on some of those earlier when we talked about wages and the workday and benefits and so on. So dealing with those issues and how the employees reach some level of satisfaction at a cost to the employer that they can live with. This level of satisfaction, or this meeting of the minds, is accomplished through the execution of a collective bargaining agreement where a union exists. And this just gives us a couple of different examples of what a collective bargaining agreement looks like. So on the left-hand side, we see that this is a public sector collective bargaining agreement between the city of Louisville, Kentucky, and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Chauffeurs, Warehousemen, and Helpers. If we look to the right, we see that this is a private sector agreement that is between GE Aviation at Evandale, Ohio, and the International Union of Automobile, Aerospace, and Agricultural Implement Workers of America. And we can see that at least with respect to the agreement to the right, we see that there's a specific date that's involved. It's a 5-year period from 2007 to 2011. And as 2011 approaches, what would happen is that the union would start to renegotiate with management on new, probably different, somewhat improved from the members' perspective, terms and conditions of the agreement with General Electric. And so again, these are just examples that are provided in the book of what a CBA looks like. So a labor organization, right, which essentially is a labor union, is defined in Section 2 of the National Labor Relations Act as any employee, committee, or other organization of any kind in which employees deal with employers concerning issues such as grievances, labor disputes, wages, working conditions. There's a multitude of work-related issues that unions then end up including in a collective bargaining agreement. This labor organization is really selected by a group of employees to represent them at the bargaining table. Even this election process that's undertaken to select a union is determined by the National Labor Relations Act. So it's a somewhat very regulated process. And so another reason to study labor relations is to learn the employee labor rights which are provided to workers under federal and state laws. Many of these laws provide important individual rights, such as those that are provided by the Equal Pay Act, Civil Rights Act, Americans with Disability Act, Family and Medical Leave Act, and Age Discrimination and Employment Act. And what we see here in this table 1.1 that's also available in the text is these acts, the year of their when they were enacted, and really just the major provisions that the act were meant to cover. And we see where you're able to see a copy of the act and some discussion of them online in the right-hand column. And so, for instance, the Equal Pay Act says that equal pay for equal work in the same workplace is required regardless of gender, and makes it unlawful to retaliate against a person who complained about pay discrimination or participated in a lawsuit with respect to pay discrimination. The Civil Rights Act makes it illegal to discriminate against someone on the basis of on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex, and it's illegal to retaliate against a person who claimed discrimination or participated in a lawsuit, and it requires employers to reasonably accommodate sincerely held religious practices except in cases of undue hardship. And that was enacted in 1964. The EO 11246, or Affirmative Action Act, required that federal contractors and subcontractors, and it requires that affirmative action must be taken by covered workers to recruit and advance qualified minorities, women, persons with disabilities, and covered veterans. And that was enacted in 1965. In 1967, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act was enacted, and that protects people aged 40 and over from discrimination because of age, and makes it unlawful to retaliate against a person who complained about pay discrimination or participated in a lawsuit, again related to age discrimination. And now to the right, we can see that the first two acts and the last act on this page we can find on the EEOC, Equal Employment website of the government, or the Department of Labor government website. And then we have a few other, acts that are presented for us here that go down to Pregnancy Discrimination Act, right? It's illegal to discriminate against a woman because of pregnancy, childbirth, or related condition. Employee Polygraph Acts, which prevents employers from using lie detector tests for pre-employment screening or during the course of employment, although there are certain exemptions. The Older Workers Benefit Protection Act, which prevents employers from age discrimination in employee benefits. So, for instance, maybe now an employer cannot not provide, refuse to provide, or decline to provide medical coverage for older workers, knowing that those older workers, because of age-related risk, might have more frequent and perhaps more expensive medical claims. So that's illegal under the 1990 Act. And then the ADA, or Americans with Disability Act, makes it illegal to discriminate against a qualified person with a disability in the private sector and in state and local governments, and illegal to retaliate against a person because a person complained about discrimination or participated in a lawsuit. And so, again, out to the right, we can see that these are on the Equal Employment website, or the Department of Labor website, or the disabilities.gov website. So now let's talk about a few of the pros and cons related to union membership. With respect to, and as we said earlier, we're going to look at this from at least two perspectives, that of members and that of management and owners, and then we'll take a more macro look at it with respect to societal view. So with respect to members, we can see there are pros that are related to higher wages, representation in discipline and discharge cases, greater job security, and better health care, pension, and paid time off benefits. And we see this sometimes, for example, with respect to higher wages. The average 2010 union hourly wage was $22.75, or 19% more than the average non-union wage of $19.04 an hour. However, even greater is the difference in benefits between union workers at $13.88 an hour and non-union workers at $7.33 an hour. And we'll talk about this a little later. But we can see that from a union member perspective, there are certainly these pros that would encourage members or employees to become and form and join unions. Now, there are some cons from the members' perspective also. Union members have to pay union dues, right? And then also, because of the structure that's put into place, and that's part of what a collective bargaining agreement does, is that it puts in place a structure by which both employees and management must follow. There are fewer individual rewards based on performance because we've taken that discretion away. The union or the collective bargaining agreement has, in some cases, taken that discretion away from management. And so those are just some of the cons. Now, if we look at this from a management or owner's perspective, while people might tend to think that managers or owners would be naturally inclined against unions, there are some pros that management has brought up, such as a system for grievance handling, right? So now managers are less responsible for resolving problems under a collective bargaining agreement because that agreement provides for an arbitration or a grievance process that should be followed. And in some cases, it's very specific with respect to, upon finding a fault, what the particular penalty is, so that it just removes a lot of that from management, and in some cases, it keeps management sort of clean in the eyes of the employee because it's the collective bargaining agreement, not the manager, who's determining what any disciplinary action is necessary. They may result in having a CBA may result in fewer individual requests or complaints because those, again, are very detailed in the CBA. And then there are standard rules reducing friction at the workplace because these rules are no longer discretionary, that may or may not be enforced, that are open to a lot of subjective of interpretation and application. They tend to be very specific, and they simply say what the rules are, and they provide for no deviation from the rules without there being a grievance. And the grievance could be by the employee against management or by management against the employee. Now, the cons are that they generally, as we discussed earlier, result in higher personnel costs, which could reduce an employer's competitive position. They result in less flexible work rules. They require or generally result in greater time spent on grievances because there are such detailed processes that are generally pretty involved, with the goal being fairness for the employee and employer, which just require more time. And then they often, because of these higher personnel costs and less flexible work rules, could result in less competitive global positions. Then we look at the idea of society, and we say, well, let's look at this now from a much higher perspective, a macro society view. Some of the pros of unions, union membership, are an increased middle class because they are, as we said earlier, they're working to raise the wages and the benefits of workers to provide more job security, both of which tend to result in a more stable and enlarged middle class. And they provide for leadership in passing major employment laws, right? So we can find countries like the United States that essentially become role models for pretty good and fair employment laws that can be referenced by other countries in how their employees are treated, or used as models for other places for how employees and labor resources are treated. Again, it's some of the cons are that they could result in a U.S. less competition in the global markets. We have, not all, some of which is supported by history, is that we do have this corrupt perception of union leaders, and that they use their position and the union resources to enhance their own personal well-being. And so there is an image of union leaders that is rooted in history that's not very good. And a lot of people would say that unions are less relevant in today's global marketplace. Again, it's a matter of perspective and whether you believe that employers will treat employees fairly under all conditions. And that's really what a CBA does. It tries to identify all of those conditions and ensure fair treatment. So anyway, these are just some of the different perspectives on the pros and cons related to union membership that are worth thinking about and keeping in mind. And so these are some of the issues, why, if I'm looking at joining a union, why would I join a union? So generally I have more job security because there are tighter rules around, when am I going to get laid off if there is a reduction in force, right? At what kind of notice am I given? What kind of benefits am I given, right? It's also, we talk about wages and benefits, and we already gave examples of how the union shop wages are somewhat generally higher, as well as benefits higher with respect to non-union shops. We talk about working conditions, and workers expect the union to protect them by negotiating for a safe and healthy working environment. We talk about this fair and just supervisions. Workers expect that the grievance and disciplinary processes negotiated by the union in a CBA will provide them protection against biased or unreasonable supervisors. We talk about this idea of a need to belong, right? And so for many individuals, there's a need to belong to a larger group that shares the same values and concerns, and a union often gives employees this mechanism for bringing them together and a social network. And then we talk about a collective voice. And so the basic principle of unionization is strength in numbers. And therefore, the individual employee believes he or she has a more powerful voice when dealing with management. To a large extent, the labor union is an entity developed as a means by which individuals could unite and have the collective power to accomplish goals that could not be accomplished alone. Whether that power was used to increase take-home wages, to ensure job protection, to improve working conditions, or simply to sit across the bargaining table as an equal to the employer, members believe that in a union there is strength. So these are a lot of the reasons why employees could join a union. Now, some people view all union management issues as either hard, meaning that there's an economic gain, such as wages and benefits and job security, or soft, meaning that how they are treated by management and coworkers. So, and 4 of the most important factors affecting the health of the American labor force were collective bargaining rights, leadership in the labor movement, union member solidarity, and inaction of the National Labor Relations Board. And these were identified via a survey of labor leaders around the country. So when we're talking about soft issues now, which are leading to employees to unionize, what we're talking about these are some of the examples of soft issues. All right, and remember we said that soft issues really deal with how employees are treated by management, versus hard issues, which really mean or relate back to economic gain and job security. And when we talk about recognition, we feel that many employers feel overworked and underappreciated. And so if supervisors don't give them the recognition, a union might give them the recognition they desire, right? So we talk about this idea of protection from humiliation. Some supervisors discipline or correct employees in the presence of their peers. And the humiliated employees can easily become a union organizer if that were to happen. We talk about the idea of hopelessness, that many employees, especially the Generation X members, feel that they will never be promoted. The pie of good jobs and good careers is shrinking, but the union organizational positions offers an alternative career. We talk about double standards, and that's ideas where we have reserved parking spaces for management, executive, dining rooms, country club memberships, paid noontime lunches, which are sort of these visible manifestations of a double standard that union organizers can easily point out during an organizing campaign. Lack of control. So many managers don't feel empowered many managers do not make their employees feel empowered to make decisions about their jobs, and so collective bargaining can give these employees some control. Job insecurity deals with non-union employees who work at will, whereas union employees can be terminated only with just cause. Then we talk about broken promises, and that is once an organizing campaign is underway, employers cannot make promises to influence a union election and only ask for a second chance if they have broken promises in the past. And then finally, we talk about representation, where supervisors and human resource professionals do not represent employee needs and stand behind them when asked, and employees may seek help from an outside source such as a union. And so again, these are just some of those soft issues that deal with management's treatment of employees that could lead union or employees to unionize. And so the rise of capitalism is often traced to the classic economics books, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which was first published in 1776. The book and the idea of capitalism certainly influenced the American founding fathers and those that followed them. The creation of private ownership of property is a cornerstone of Smith's capitalism. This freedom to enter into contracts and to decide the use of one's economic resources such as capital and labor are essential concepts in capitalism. Right. Owners of capital are free to invest their economic resources in raw materials, plant and equipment, machinery, and so on, as well as invest in the labor of workers, which is available through the labor market. Just as employers are free to seek employees and offer them economic resources such as wages and benefits in exchange for labor, employees are also free to enter into contracts or not for their labor. And so just as these employees are free to enter into these contracts for labor or not, they also have individual rights of freedom to contract, which means that they have the right to join other individuals and bargain collectively with employer over the terms of their wages, benefits, and other conditions of employment. The right of workers to bargain collectively is consistent with the principles of freedom of contract, as well as owner and worker property rights. Exactly how employers and employees may lawfully engage in collective bargaining evolved over a period of years, and it's discussed later in Chapter 2. And so here what we talk about are trends in U.S. union memberships. And what we can see here is that for the first time, the number of union members working in the public sector exceeded the number of union members working in the private sector, particularly in manufacturing, where the globalization effect of outsourcing American manufacturing jobs to other countries has significantly reduced the total number of jobs in the United States, together with a steady rise in union memberships in all levels of government, which began in the 1960s when President Kennedy issued the executive order that first allowed federal employees to organize into unions, and the steady progression of state and local governments passing similar laws from the 60s through the 1980s. We also would expect that this trend is likely to continue. The U.S. Department of Labor analysis of the growth and declines of union memberships from 2003 to 2005 found that the 5 unions with the largest increase in memberships were in public service industries, that is, elementary and secondary schools, hospitals, justice and public safety, colleges and universities, and healthcare non-hospitals. And so, again, what we just see here, presented here, is the idea that our public sector union membership has outgrown private sector union memberships for all the reasons that we just talked about. And so we can see here, it's from this discussion why workers in many manufacturing industries chose to unionize after the passage of the 1935 National Labor Relations Act. At that point in time, in 1935, we had manufacturing facilities that were often oppressive places of employment. At that time, men would line up at the gate, and if there was work, they would send home. If they were hired, it was for that day and that day only. There was no continuous employment. And these men never knew whether their workday would end, when it would end, until the whistle blew. And that could be 10 hours later, it could be 12 hours later, it could be 14 hours later. There's also, stories about auto workers who recall that foremen were so intimidating that workers had to do the foreman's yard work on weekends or had to bring along family members to provide other services. These foremen managed by terror and hired prize fighters to keep control. And so, when we have that type of an employment circumstance or condition, that's hard to imagine in today's world, but back in 1935, those conditions did exist. It's easy to understand how union workers, or why workers would choose to unionize. We also see here where union membership rates by state based on a 2007 annual results. And with this, we can see that the demographic makeup of union membership has gradually changed to about 75% white, 15% black, and 11% Hispanic. Right? We can also see that that union membership varies greatly And so we can see that where 20% or more union membership is in states like New York and Washington, where we have 15% to 20% union membership in states like Pennsylvania and West Virginia, D.C., Maine, New England, and on, where down to states where we have 4.9% or less union membership in states like Texas and South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia. And there are obviously a lot of conditions that drive this that may be unique to certain geographic regions or certain industries where unions may proliferate, and then how those industries may fall out by state. But it's interesting to see that there's a large mix across the U.S. with respect to union membership. So union leaders do have reason to hope that for a reversal in declining numbers. A 2007 poll by Peter D. Hart Research Associates indicated that 53% of all non-union workers would vote for union representation if given the opportunity. So, and according to the AFL-CIO, the results indicate that the gap between those who have a union and want a union is tremendous. The key to driving workers is the chance to unionize, according to labor leaders. It's to change the legal process by which workers can choose a union. And so labor leaders have supported a proposed new law, the Employee Free Choice Act, which would require the National Labor Relations Board to certify a union to represent workers if a majority signs cards that authorize the union. Current law usually requires a secret ballot election process. Union leaders believe organizing would be much easier under this proposed new law. And so here, given the that what we talked about, this shrinking of union representation, we also can see some of the industries where there's opportunities for growth, and those are in industries like the hospitality industry, the healthcare industry, airline and casino industries, shipping industries, professional worker industries, and immigrant workers. And each of these opportunities, right, are unique to specific industries, and so the workers in those industries generally have unique concerns around some of the characteristics in those industries. Obviously, pay and benefits are a common concern across all industries, but as we get into some of these other industries, we can see that perhaps there are industry-specific issues around the health and safety, right? Particularly in things like the airline, or in places like the airline industry, or we talk about the working conditions, right? Again, we want safe and clean working conditions. We also want the length of the day, right? So what is how can employees work the hours they're supposed to work, given some of the concerns in industries like the healthcare industry? So management and labor work in cooperation in a number of ways that we'll talk about during the semester. But generally what happens is we don't hear much about it until a union goes on strike, right? And then it's all over the news. However, there are a lot of cases where management and unions, or management and labor, are working together very smoothly to avoid this idea of a strike. And this cooperation can take a lot of forms, including voluntary recognition of the union. And so while it's unusual, in some cases management agreed to voluntarily recognize a union as a bargaining representative for a group of employees and began contract negotiations, rather than resist the union and insist on secret ballot elections. This performance-based incentive systems, right, is another way that management and management and labor are working together. A growing number of CBAs contain provisions that base future employee pay increases on increased specified employer performance measures. So the employer has to be profitable. There has to be something positive at the employer level, and then that gets passed to the employee level. This idea of employee teams, increasingly our CBAs are contain provisions for employee teams and these teams are most often take the form of a permanent self-managed team, a problem-solving team, or quality circles to improve quality and develop solutions for particular problems, or special project teams, which are usually 10 to 15 people from different functions brought together to design and develop a new process or product. QWL, or Quality of Work-Life programs, involve union and management representatives that meet to improve communications and general quality of life in the workplace. The federal government, also through the National Partnership Councils, teams of unions and management officials represent over 310,000 federal unionized employees developed to improve systems of communication and efficiency. And then we have this integrative collective bargaining. So when a positive labor management climate allows for integrated collective bargaining, as opposed to what we normally would or more often see as a adversarial relationship, then the union and management negotiating work teams can work collaboratively to seek mutually acceptable proposals on issues on common concern and brainstorm outside of the box solution to problems. And so these are all examples of ways that labor and management cooperation can exist to help to turn the labor management relationship into a win-win situation. So we also want to talk about this GMNUMI, or New United Motor Manufacturing Inc. venture. And so what this was a unique international joint effort between General Motors and Toyota and the United Auto Workers. In 1962, General Motors had built a new Chevrolet plant in Fremont, California, but by 1982, the plant's constant labor problems were blamed for poor quality, low productivity, and high absenteeism, and General Motors decided to close the plant. But in 1983, the plant reopened as this new United Motor Manufacturing Inc., and it was representing this unique international joint effort between General Motors and Toyota and the UAW. And was one of the first major examples of labor management cooperation in the United States, and it was the first example in the United States of a Japanese-style team management with U.S. workers. Over the next couple of years, the new Japanese management combined with UAW memberships, or UAW members, to make U.S. labor history. For years, General Motors had complained that the UAW was cause of its problems at the Fremont plant, but 85% of the NUMI workers were those same union workers who, when combined with Japanese management, produced high-quality Toyota Corollas and Chevrolet Novas, then Prisms. The NUMI plant convinced many American workers that the old problems were with American management, not with the American labor. And so how did these Japanese management practices change one of the least productive U.S. auto plants into one of the finest? And it was through cooperation, right? The most significant change was the spirit of cooperation that began with the UAW-NUMI letter of intent. It was through fewer job classifications. Right? It was through fewer supervisors, meaning teams performed routine management functions and focused on building quality rather than inspecting for it. And then it was through work teams, and that's the 2,400 hourly workers were organized into teams of 5 to 10 members who rotate among as many as 15 different tasks. So, however, the unique GM Toyota NUMI plant closed in April of 2010, a victim of the Great Recession of 2008 that caused General Motors to close many U.S. plants, including this Fremont, California plant. And so next we want to talk about the different types of unions. Skilled craft workers formed the original unions in America. These craft unions represented many groups of workers who shared a skill or an occupation, such as electricians or carpenters or bricklayers. Unions such as the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers are examples of such craft unions. Industrial unions found their start in factories where largely unskilled laborers worked. Organizing the entire plant into one union gave the workers the necessary leverage to counteract the availability of unskilled non-union workers. Unions in the entertainment and professional sports industries are growing and are often not highlighted in the media until the public is directly affected by their labor activities. You'll recall that in 2011, the NBA went through a very protracted strike that gave the this area of professional sports unions a lot of visibility. Essentially, this NBA union, the National Basketball Association, this union was demised and turned into a players' association, which was then reformed to be a union. But the upshot of all of the activity with respect to that was that it delayed the start of the season from November 1st, the basketball season from November 1st to December 25th, and it reduced the number of games from 82 to 66. So this is a prime example of how we may not think unions impact us, but they do impact us on a day-to-day basis. And for big basketball fans, this was a huge deal back in 2011. For a lot of the players and for a lot of the owners, it also resulted in a loss of earnings for the players because there were fewer games. It also resulted in a loss of revenue because there were fewer games. The ticket sales were less, concession sales were less from a player or from an owner's perspective. We also look at transportation unions, and those are in the areas like the railway and airline industries, such as the United Transportation Union and the Airline Pilots Association. And these unions are governed by the Railway Labor Act, which differs from the National Labor Relations Act. After the 1981 strike by the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, the public became more aware of the impact of unionization on the airline industries. And then finally, unions of agricultural workers like the United Farm Workers, founded by Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, don't have protections of the National Labor Relations Act, but they do have rights under California law and still organize and gain recognition through concerted activities. And if you'll look on page 27 of the text in Profile 1-2, you'll see a profile of Cesar Chavez and the rise of the United Farm Workers. And so this figure 1.5 in our text on page 29 just simply gives us models of the labor relations in the sports industry. And the key elements of the labor relations in professional sports are three principal participants, which are management, and those are the leagues and team owners, the labor, which are the players and the unions, and the government. The federal government performs the regulatory function under the National Labor Relations Act in the same capacity that it oversees all private commerce. A body of the National Labor Relations Board and court decisions are unique to collective bargaining in professional sports has been compiled since 1935. In this respect, the sports industry is similar to any other American industry such as steel, auto, service, and clothing in that it does fall under the National Labor Relations Act, but it contains past practices, unions, and historical events which are unique to the industry. So now we want to talk some about the National Labor Relations Board, which oversees most labor relations activities in the private sector and was created in 1935 by the National Labor Relations Act. The purpose of the National Labor Relations Act was to minimize industrial strife interfering with the normal flow of commerce. Congress created a federally protected interest in the internal operations of certain industries. That interest was in setting the legal process by which labor and management would engage in collective bargaining. To that end, the NLRA gave employees certain protected rights. These are enumerated in Section 7. And these rights include the right to self-organize, to form, join, or assist labor organizations, to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing, to engage in other concerted activities for the purpose of collective bargaining, and to refrain from any or all of the earlier mentioned activities. And so for those rights that are provided to the employee, the Act also lists employer activities that are considered to be unfair labor practices in violating those rights. And they include actions that interfere with employees' rights that we discussed earlier, interfering with the formation or administration of a union, which is deemed illegal, discriminating against union members, or refusing to bargain with employers or employees' representatives. When these labor disputes arise, the party turn to the enforcement agency of the National Labor Relations Act, which is So this board is a 5-member body appointed for 5-year terms by the President of the United States with the advice and consent of the Senate. The NRLB, or National Labor Relations Board, has the authority to investigate and prevent unfair safe practices and, through a wide range of remedies, to protect the rights of the public in connection with labor disputes affecting commerce. 4 basic principles guide the NLRB's administration. They are to encourage collective bargaining, recognize majority representation, enforce the law through administrative proceedings, and impose penalty for violations. And here we see again that the NLRB has jurisdiction over persons when there is a labor dispute affecting commerce or when there is a controversy involving an employer, employee, or labor organization. And these can become important. Sometimes we wonder, well, what's the government's role in these employer-employee labor relations? And, if you think about it, and a strike because of a dispute between an employer and employee disrupts travel, right? Well, that has commerce considerations, and it could also threaten the safety of the population or of citizens. And so there is some vested interest in the government that these all be resolved timely and amicably. And so for the government to get involved, the following tests must be met before the board is empowered to act. So when we talk about persons, the definition of a person under the National Labor Relations Act is all-inclusive and involves one or more individuals, labor organizations, partnerships, associations, corporations, legal representatives, trustees, or trustees in bankruptcy, or receivers. We talk about a labor dispute. So a labor dispute must exist for the board to exercise jurisdiction. And the Act defines the labor dispute as any controversy concerning terms, tenure, or conditions of employment. When we talk about affecting commerce, there's a broad definition of commerce under the statute that gives the board authority in all but purely local disputes. So the board has jurisdiction if the labor dispute directly affects commerce. In addition, if the employer's operation affects commerce, any labor dispute involving that employer falls within the board's jurisdiction. We talk about the idea of employees, right? So the board's definition of employee is literally construed, so no exclusions in the definition become important in determining who is not an employee. The types of workers not covered include agricultural workers, domestic servants, persons employed by a spouse or a parent, independent contractors, supervisors, individuals who work for employers subject to the Railway Labor Act, and employees of the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve Bank, states, or political subdivisions. We talk about employers, and the definition of employer then in order to have jurisdiction by the National Labor Relations Board is anyone who also takes on broad connotations by listing those persons who are not employers, such as the U.S. government or a wholly owned government corporation, with the exception of the U.S. Postal Service, the Federal Reserve Bank, a state or political subdivision, or anyone subject to the Railway Labor Act or any labor organization. These are not employers. And then we talk about labor organizations. And so labor organizations are most commonly labor unions, but the NLRB recognizes other kinds of employee committees that represent their employees to employers. And so labor organizations are also subject under the Act to the Unfair Labor Practices section that places some limitations on strikes supported by the organization. And so finally we get into this idea of preemption. And so a question of preemption arises when a field of activity, such as a collective bargaining or labor relations, is subject to regulation by both the federal and state governments, and a decision must be made as to whether concurrent jurisdiction exists or if the federal government enjoys exclusive jurisdiction. The Constitution is clear that federal law is the supreme law of the land, and so a factual determination must be made as to whether Congress has entered and completely covered a field or activity. So again, Preemption is a legal theory which says federal law takes precedent over state law. So the U.S. Supreme Court decided that preemption issue as it relates to labor management relationships in a series of cases. If an activity is clearly protected under Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act, the state is totally preempted from the field and the federal law controls. Section 7 of the law provides, or the Labor Relations Act provides employees the rights to self-organize, to form, join, or assist labor organizations, to bargain collectively, to engage in other concerted activities, or to refrain from doing all these. Also, Section 8 of the Unfair Labor Practice section prohibits the activity sought to be regulated by the state, and the state is totally preempted from the field. And so this concludes Chapter 1. I think it gives us a good background of labor relations. It clarifies a lot of terminology. It sets the stage and provides a lot of context. And so I encourage you to read the chapter thoroughly and make sure you're comfortable with all of the discussion around labor relations, referring to a process between management and the representation of employees, that is a union, utilized to make decisions in the workplace concerning issues such as wages, benefits, working conditions, hours, safety, job security, and grievance procedures. We talked about a lot of the pros and cons about why employees would unionize, and we looked at those from from the individual's perspective, from the employer's perspective, and then from a societal perspective. We talked about the different types of unions, and then we talked about the Labor Relations Act itself as it's executed by the Labor Relations or the National Labor Relations Board, which was established to enforce the act. So please make sure you're comfortable with all these, and then concepts, ideas, and topics. They're great background to know, and from a human resource perspective, you really need to know them in order to understand, what we're doing with respect to labor relations. And then let's move into Chapter 2, and also please work on the discussion forums and the assignments, which I encourage you to contribute to freely and generously, because it's that conversation that helps us to better understand the discipline and the topics. And thanks for your time and attention.